Well, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology, joined by Andrew Mioni. He is the author of Altar Against Altar, an analysis of Catholic traditionalism. And we are going to be talking about Catholic traditionalism specifically from the angle of the Society of St. Pius X and whether or not the SSPX is in schism. And so we're going to discuss that and explore many other related topics. Andrew, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Michael. I'm doing well. Thanks for the invitation. And thank you for your advanced read of the book and for going through it and offering a testimonial. I really appreciate that.
Glad to do it, and I'm looking forward to that hard copy so I can get it in my hands.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm really excited about that. So you just released this, and I want to talk about it. But before we dive in specifically to the book, tell me a little bit about yourself and your background here.
Sure. So I have a pretty extensive history with what some people will call the traditionalist movement. And I'm going to
Mhm.
explain a little bit about how I understand that term because the context that it's used in this book is maybe a little different from what most people understand. So,
Yeah.
so my earliest days, a young kid, I was with the Society of St. John, which I think probably most people don't know about. It was a group in the late 90s, early 2000s near Scranton. They
Mhm.
were a canonically legitimate group, but they got shut down after about 5 years. So they were pretty short lived.
Mhm.
I grew up going to a fraternity of St. Peter Chapel. We didn't officially switch, but I spent some time, a couple years at an SSPX school. That's where I met my now wife. So I was kind of going to mass there, occasionally with her. So I have a couple years of experience with them. And then after a time when we moved, we were going to an Institute of Christ the King church for about a year and a half. And since then, we moved a couple of years ago, and I'm very happily attending my local diocesan church. So I have run the rounds. I have been through all of
Yeah.
them. So yeah,
Did you ever go to SSPX Chapel, or was it just?
I did for a little bit, but never as a registered parishioner. I guess we
Mhm.
would do kind of when we were dating, we would go to SSPX one Sunday and then the fraternity the next Sunday and kind of bounce back and forth. So yeah, like twice a month for about, I don't know, 8 months or so. So
Oh,
for a little while, yeah.
okay. What was it like when you were there?
Um, it was, I mean, I'd kind of gotten a taste for it being in the school, so I kind of knew what to expect. So some of the things that came from the pulpit or came from after mass chats, which maybe would have surprised some newcomers, I wasn't entirely surprised by. But yeah, I definitely remember sitting there listening to a sermon about how we can't go over to Maple Hill, we can't go to the fraternity chapel, and I was sitting there awkwardly like, well, that's where I'm going next week. So that
So they
was,
would actively direct people away from the fraternity chapel?
oh yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Interesting. And what was their contention with it? Do you recall offhand? Did they ever say explicitly?
So that sermon was kind of in tandem with why we as the SSPX reject
Mhm.
Vatican II, the
Mhm.
fraternity accepts Vatican II,
Mhm.
so you
Mhm.
you should have nothing to do with them. Essentially,
Mhm.
don't even go to their chapels. I found that there's a disconnect between their public information that they put out, where when they get
Mhm.
asked, can we go over to an institute or fraternity or whatever, in their public material, like their podcast, they'll say kind of, well, we can't really tell you not to, but it's really not a good idea, all this. They
Mhm.
kind of play in the gray area. But then when it comes to kind of boots on the ground, hard experience, actually being there and in their classrooms and their pulpits,
Mhm.
yeah, they'll tell you, yeah, don't go.
So let's talk a little bit about the Second Vatican Council. Of course, you have a chapter specifically designated to this. Tell me a little bit about what you've heard some Catholic traditionalists say about it, and also define the term traditionalist if you don't mind.
Sure. Yes.
Then, yeah, let's explore what the church says about Vatican II.
Sure. So really quick, yeah, just for everyone's benefit, traditionalism. So this is the book right here, Altar Against
Mhm.
Altar. Yeah, the subtitle is An Analysis of Catholic Traditionalism. And I know a lot of people understand that term as kind of an umbrella term to encompass all of these groups or people who preferred going to the Latin Mass or whatnot. This book is specifically directed at those independent groups. And I refer to them as traditionalists because, at least my reasoning is that they started to call themselves at these independent groups after the Second Vatican Council. They kind of set up their own communities, their own churches and whatnot, and they labeled themselves were the traditionalists. right? And they use it as a term to kind of separate themselves from other people,
Mhm.
distinguish themselves from other people. And then the people who were then reconciled to the church from these groups like the SSPX, for example, the Fraternity of St. Peter, when they got reconciled to the church, I don't believe they should call themselves traditionalists. I think that's qualifying the term Catholic in a way that doesn't need to be qualified. You should just be Catholic, no more, no less. There shouldn't be any reason to say I'm a specific type of Catholic. If you're within the communion of the church, you happen to prefer the Latin Mass, that's great. Go to your Latin Mass. That's totally fine. But yeah, this book is specifically about groups who don't have canonical mission, who don't have delegated jurisdiction, who set up their own chapels, SSPX, SSPV, Sedevacantists, any other independent groups out there. So that's what this book is about. So if you're watching and you like to go to your local diocesan Latin Mass or your local Fraternity of St. Peter chapel, this book is not directed at you. So just to get that out there. So yeah.
Yeah, so you're not contesting the role of sacred tradition in Catholicism. You're
Right.
not against tradition.
Exactly.
You're making a distinction between tradition and traditionalism.
Right. Right. Yep. Traditionalism, I think, is its own ism, is its own thing, its own distinct thing that I think we need to consider it as such. So yeah, this is about those groups and communities who would set themselves apart in some way, some official way.
It's kind of like the distinction between Orthodoxy and Eastern Orthodoxy. We're all Orthodox. We better be. If you're
Yeah.
not, you're a heretic.
Right.
So we're all Orthodox in our teachings,
Right.
but we would not be Eastern Orthodox as
Right.
Catholics. And so I think that's a helpful distinction that you're making here, but it is something that a lot of people are going to probably misunderstand until you make that distinction. I suppose there's probably people who hear that, wait, you're talking negatively about traditionalism,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to interpret that as a critique of tradition, and it's not the same.
Right. Not the case. Yep. This is specifically about juridically independent groups. So that's the easiest way I can put it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yep.
Now let's talk a little bit about the Second Vatican Council. Talk to me about what you wrote about.
Sure. So the Second Vatican Council, I remember as I did my research and actually looked into the facts and the history behind it and compared it with those things that I'd been told growing up, or that at least were heavily implied, things did not match up. So probably the most glaring error, I guess, or the most glaring accusation is that the Second Vatican Council did promote error, positive error, did promote potential heresy, did promote, at the very least, ambiguous teachings, and the ambiguous enough that we need to set up a ministry to oppose it. That's at least the minimum that we can do. So, and as I looked into why the council was called, because that was never really explained, in all honesty, we didn't really get a reason for why we had this council, what it was trying to do, the reforms that came about. So I know some people will say, and I address this in the book, of, the councils are only called to address whatever heresy is happening at the time, or whatever error is happening at the time. And they'll say there was no error, there was no heresy going on in the mid 20th century. Well, Pope St. John the 23rd would disagree with you, and he made it very clear in his address, in his statement explaining why the council was called. And he says it's because of the state of the world and the state of culture and society that we're overcome by what he termed militant atheism. We're overcome by secularism and materialism, and people have kind of sidelined God for the sake of material gain and material prosperity. And in a world that was only becoming more connected through, technological advancements, more wealthy through this, the industrial revolution, the sexual revolution, like all these things that were radically reshaping the face of the world, and especially of Western civilization, that needed to be, the church couldn't just let that go and let it overcome the world without doing something. And he even calls it a crisis. So if we're getting into what the real crisis is, I know when I say Vatican II was actually called to address the crisis, that gets some looks, that gets some responses, but it's true that the real crisis is a crisis of what I call a crisis of functionality, where, and this is all over encyclicals from the late 19th, early 20th century. Pope Benedict XVI writes about this a lot, and I cite him quite a bit, is that the world is, as he puts it, he said, the great poverty of our age is that we now only think in terms of function. And so if something like spiritual, or supernatural faith is not functional, if it doesn't yield any measurable result, if it doesn't gain anything for you, if it doesn't advance your prosperity or anything like that, it's essentially useless, according to the mindset of the 20th and 21st century. And that's what the council was trying to address, was say, let's get back to basics here. Let's bring it back to kind of the heart of the gospel and evangelization, and bringing the gospel out into the world, instead of relying so much on, I guess, external ritual. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but when I read that, when I researched that, and then I compared it to my experiences growing up, because I like to say I grew up in a world where Vatican II didn't happen, because essentially the communities I grew up in, they obviously, we didn't say the new Mass. We didn't read or discuss the documents of Vatican II. It was never mentioned in homilies or anything like that. So, they accepted it on paper, in the fraternity and the institute and whatnot. They accepted it on paper. And I'm sure if I were to go to my parish priest and say, I'd like to read the documents of Vatican II, he wouldn't have discouraged me, but I don't know that he necessarily would have pushed it either. He wouldn't have encouraged it. So that's kind of the main thing I realized. Which is
unfortunate, because there was a need for the Second Vatican Council for us to be aware of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're touching on an observation I've noticed as well, and that is John the 23rd makes it very clear in his opening speech. The purpose here is not to change the dogmas of the church; those are immutable, but rather to communicate them to society more effectively. Now, you can argue how effective we have been in that mission. That's certainly debatable, but that was the intention and purpose for the Second Vatican Council. So I'm glad you're bringing this up here. That's helpful. Mm-hmm. By the way, yeah. I for somebody who says, well, we've only had ecumenical councils called to address a heresy, that's just factually not true. We've had several ecumenical councils that were called to be more disciplinary in nature and address disciplinary issues. Yeah. So we've actually had ecumenical councils in the first millennium that did not refute a heresy. Right. So, yeah, I think that talking point really isn't actually reflective of reality.
Right. Yep, I would agree. Yeah, it's as I say in the book, it's maybe this crisis that we find ourselves in is not as specific a theological error, if you could say that, about as, for example, Arianism, with Nicaea, or Protestantism, or what have you. It's a little more nebulous. It's a little more all-encompassing, but it's still most certainly a pressing issue that needs to be addressed. And that's the reason for the council, was to address this major issue that was kind of encroaching on the 21st century, on the turn of the century. And they were saying, big things are about to happen. We need to be prepared for this, because the world is changing in ways that it has never encountered before, that it has never had to deal with before. And so that was an eye-opener for me, for sure.
Now, your book is altar against altar. So we're talking about rival altars here.
Yes.
Of course, part of that is going to include the SSPX. There's going to be some people who say, hey, look, the excommunications of the bishops that Lefebvre ordained have been lifted. Pope Francis has granted the SSPX particular faculties, such as in the confessional. And so, hey, look, they're not in schism anymore. And so this isn't fair to discuss them as an altar against altar, or a rival altar.
Sure.
What would you say in response to that?
I've had to deal with this same response before. And I would ask someone, if what they do is not a rival altar, what is? If them coming into a diocese, setting up a church without approval, offering the Eucharist without approval, ministering in a lot of cases against the direct orders of the bishop, as they themselves admit, how's that not a rival altar? How's that not an opposing place of worship? How's that not an unlawful place of worship? I'd be really curious how someone would explain what they would need to do further for it to be a rival altar, because what they're doing is coming in and saying that mass is ambiguous, evil, potentially heretical. It's a danger to your soul. You can't go to it. As I point out, they've published some material that says, yeah, it has examinations of conscience in it that say, did I attend the new mass, as if implying that it's a sin to attend the new mass. So that's probably the first thing I would say is, what further would they have to do?
And about that particular point,
Sure.
I've seen them on video, the society officially say that even a well celebrated reverent novus ordo is an offense to God. That's their term,
Mhm.
an offense to God, and you should not attend it.
Right.
And so, if you don't have a society mass available, and all you have is a novus ordo, even if it's well done, celebrated reverently, you can't attend it because it's an offense to God, and thus you should stay home and pray your rosary.
Mm-hmm.
That's some of the most destructive and demonic advice I've ever heard in my life. So a person is actually being directed to stay away from the sacraments of Jesus Christ and the grace given to them in the sacraments, because the liturgy that the church has officially promulgated is itself destructive to souls. There are so many theological and spiritual problems with that position.
Yeah.
What's your reaction when you hear stuff like that?
Again, I would want them to try to explain how that makes sense, how it is that the church could officially promulgate a rite of mass that is harmful to your soul. I don't know how you get around the indefectibility of the church with that statement on how the church, they'll say, no, the church hasn't defected, but the church has promulgated a rite of mass that is spiritually harmful to you, or the church has, um, you know, commanded something of you or required you to adapt a new practice that is actively working against your salvation. And this gets into their whole salvation of souls crisis. The justification for their ministry is that we're doing this for the salvation of souls, as if the church is not providing for the salvation of souls. You would necessarily have to admit that. So I don't understand how those two things can be reconciled, if you will.
Now, when it comes to the liturgical reform, you have a section sectioned off specifically for this. Some people are going to wonder, why did we even have that with the Second Vatican Council? Why did Sacrosanctum Concilium go forward with a liturgical reform? Because, hey, wasn't everything working out with the liturgy? Why tamper with it if it's not broke? Why try to fix it?
Yeah. So this is something that, again, if you read, I read a lot of Pope Benedict XVI, and he has a lot of writings on this, where the Mass, the Latin Mass, if you will, as it's celebrated today, is, I think, done by communities or priests who are actively trying to, I don't want to say make it attractive, but it's not reflective of how it was before the council. Ratzinger talks about this all the time, where he says, and you hear anecdotes all the time about how people prayed their rosaries in pews and people didn't understand what was going on and all these things. And I think those are legitimate points to make, but I think they kind of miss the bigger picture of why we needed a reform, because you don't reform your entire rite of mass because people aren't really paying attention. There are deeper issues here. And one of them that Joseph Ratzinger talks about a lot is how the mass was overlaid with, he describes it as a fresco that had been whitewashed over by later generations, and said that it was kind of overburdened with, as he called it, superfluous accretions of historical value, of purely historical value. There were things that had, once the missal was codified in 1570 with Pius V, it became impossible to, ironically, incorporate any kind of organic development, because you can't make any changes to the Mass except from top-down decrees from the Holy See. You can't bring in regional or cultural practices, which is how it kind of got to that stage in the first place. So it was codified and it was locked in, but then it became kind of, I guess, overburdened by ritualism, if you will, by routine, by habit, and uh, again, as Ratzinger says, that it had been layered over by a lot of private devotions, by a lot of repetitions and gestures that maybe over the course of time had lost their original intent. So, for example, like the prayers at the foot of the altar and the last gospel, those are two things that people bring up a lot when they're talking about the reform. Those originally served as private devotions for the priest to say as he vested and divested for Mass. So there's these things that were not really part of the liturgy for a very long time, and that came in, and that what they wanted to do was get back to the heart of worship. I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but what Ratzinger says was the essence of liturgy, the essence of ancient Christian worship was kind of buried under these external rituals and external gestures, and they wanted to bring that out. Now, whether or not they did or how well they did obviously is a bigger conversation, but the point of the liturgical reform was to restore, as he said, restore mystery to the liturgy and not be overburdened with ritualism. Again, whether or not they restored mystery, that's a bigger conversation, or whether or not it was celebrated as such in the years following, that's a bigger conversation. But that was the intention of the council and of the council fathers. It was voted on by almost every single bishop there. And this is where I think, again, the liturgical reform argument kind of loses some of its steam, because what was it, 2,147 bishops all agreed on Sacrosanctum Concilium. And if you read Sacrosanctum Concilium, it calls for some pretty sweeping reforms. It doesn't call for just tweaking a few minor gestures or doing a couple small things. It's pretty extensive. And they all voted yes on this, except for 4 bishops of the entire church. And so when the church universally agrees that this has to happen, and they go through all the time and effort to make it happen, and then the result is not to some people's liking, and they start saying, well, you never had the power to change the Mass anyway because quo primum or something, I think that's just silly. And it kind of falls on its face, because where was this argument? Where was this where was this pushback when everyone agreed that it had to happen? It didn't. This pushback didn't happen until some people didn't like the result, and then they tried to find excuses for why we just don't have to accept this at all. It just it's historically inconsistent.
Not only that, but with the quo primum thing, the missal was changed many times after quo primum,
right,
by the very one who promulgated quo primum.
Right.
So he's basically saying nobody can change the missal except the Pope. Obviously, the Pope can, but nobody else can. But yeah, this is interesting, because it's doing a number of things. It's wanting to increase active participation. It's also wanting to restore some things that were apostolic in nature, apostolic practices that had been lost in the Roman Rite for a while for various reasons. And there were good reasons for it at the time, but some of them were no longer applicable. For instance, communion under both kinds for the laity. That's apostolic in nature. So there was a move here to restore the chalice to the laity, because this is apostolic, and the need for restricting communion for the laity under one kind is really no longer there. That need's no longer there. We don't have a lot of utriquists out there anymore. So yeah, okay, we can go ahead and have that conversation. So there were some efforts to restore some things that were ancient in nature that would be beneficial. Now, again, how successful it was is certainly, like you said, a wider conversation.
Sure. And for those people who would maybe throw out the antiquarianism argument, I'll again point out that Sacrosanctum Concilium very specifically states that ancient practices that the church now sees as beneficial once more, we're going to reintroduce. And 99.9% of all bishops agreed, yes, let's do that.
That's not the same as antiquarianism. Antiquarianism is, well, if it's old, it must be good and right. And no, that's not necessarily the case. Rebaptism is really ancient. Rebaptism goes back to the ancient church, but obviously rebaptism is sacrilegious. So yeah, that's more what is being referred to. And I would agree that, just because it's old doesn't necessarily make it right. But ultimately, it's the church that determines what is beneficial in antiquity and what is not, and what's an innovation or what's a departure from apostolic tradition. So let's talk a little bit about the state of necessity. with
Sure.
the Society of St. Pius X, because, as you know, many are going to say, hey, look, we have the ability to operate in the way that we're doing. You say we're engaging in this business of a rival altar, but actually, we have the ability to do this because state of necessity. Walk us
Sure.
through that.
Sure. A state of necessity, as I alluded to earlier, would necessarily imply a defection of the church, because you're saying there's a necessity to minister against the wishes of the church, as if it's essentially stating that the church can internally work against herself, or that the hierarchy or the authority of the church is distinct from itself and can work against itself somehow. And I'd like to start this conversation by a quote from Pope Pius VI in 1791. This was a scenario where he was responding to the errors of the civil constitution of the clergy during the French Revolution. This is cited in the book, which is chapter 5, The State of Necessity. So there were several priests who were illicitly consecrated bishops, in the same way that traditionalist bishops are today, which is by a bishop who did not have the mandate from the Holy See to consecrate them a bishop. They didn't have the delegated jurisdiction to consecrate them a bishop. I want to read off what Pope Pius VI said, because this, I think, is a very explicit condemnation from the Holy See itself on this idea of an appeal to a state of necessity. This is a little bit longer, but I'm going to read the whole thing. Again, this is Pius VI talking about bishops who are illicitly consecrated. He says the following, quote, "We similarly declare and decree that their consecrations were sinful and are illicit, unlawful, sacrilegious, and at variance with the regulations of the sacred canons. Since they were rashly and wrongfully elected, they lack all ecclesiastical and spiritual jurisdiction for the guidance of souls, and have been suspended from all exercise of the episcopal office. We therefore severely forbid the wickedly elected and illicitly consecrated men, under this punishment of suspension, to assume episcopal jurisdiction or any other authority for the guidance of souls, since they have never received it." And this is the key sentence here. "Nor must they appoint, depute, or confirm pastors, vicars, missionaries, helpers, functionaries, ministers, or others, whatever their title, for the care of souls and the administration of the sacraments, under any pretext of necessity whatsoever." That is quite an explicit condemnation of appealing to a state of necessity. From the Holy See itself, and a quite old citation. I'll read another one here, another source that I have, which is not the Holy See, but it is, again, kind of older or pre-Vatican II, if you will. This is the Reverend John McHale in 1842. He wrote in his book called The Evidences and Doctrines of the Catholic Church. He said, quote, "Those who in every age have obtruded themselves into the sanctuary without any authentic evidence of their delegation have been treated as usurpers. In vain will such arrogant individuals plead the corruption of the Church of Christ to color with the plea of necessity their own usurpation. If therefore any are deluded by the specious invectives of the sectaries against the corruption of the apostolical ministry, they must be the willing dupes of error, since the divine commission of our Redeemer, which he has never yet recalled, is a standing pledge of its indefectibility." So I think that ties it in really well to the idea of indefectibility, and why appealing to necessity to minister against the church implies that the church has done something harmful to souls, or that she has promulgated something that's harmful to souls, or she has enforced something that will actively harm your soul, and so we have to minister against the church. That, again, I don't see how you reconcile that with the dogma of indefectibility. And one of the individuals who wrote a testimonial for this book is a former SSPX priest. And he said the following. He wrote a letter to Bishop Fillet explaining why he was leaving the society in 1999. And he said the following, quote, "Despite our labored attempts to theologically explain things away, we must state that the church has erred. That is, it has failed to lead souls to heaven. Despite our earnest protests to the contrary, we cannot avoid practical heresy in asserting that the church is not indefectible." So even he recognized it, that this is an inconsistent claim to justify a ministry. As I say in the book, if their ministry is necessary because the church is not providing for the salvation of souls, how does one admit she has not defected? And if she has not defected, why is their ministry necessary? It doesn't work any way you spin the conversation. This doesn't hold water. There are several other examples, citations, parallels with, for example, I parallel this with the Old Testament when God makes the covenant with Abram before he was Abraham. Tells him that he'll be the father of a great nation, but Abraham his wife, Sarah, doesn't believe that. She doesn't see how that can happen because she is old, barren, she can't have children. All natural circumstances seem to indicate that this covenant with God, even though it's verified by God himself, it seems to be that this cannot be fulfilled because all natural circumstances indicate that it can't. So she convinces Abram to have a child with her maidservant because she says, I can't give you a child, even though God promised that it would happen. I can't do it. And I make the comparison here that Abram and Sarah lost their trust in God and their trust that, anything is possible with the Almighty, and this might be fulfilled in a way that you will not expect or that you couldn't have not foreseen. And so in the same way, these independent groups who think that the church has promulgated a spiritually harmful rite of mass or sacraments that may or may not be invalid, the recognize and resist traditionalists seem to be, again, kind of in a gray area here on whether or not it's valid. I think, again, publicly, officially, they'll state that it is, but in private, they'll tell people it's questionable. And then obviously the sedevacantist just say it's invalid completely, which would imply that the church is just on this long, slow death march, essentially, that all these priests are invalid, these bishops are invalid, and it will just die out completely if we don't just churn out priests and bishops to kind of fill the gaps and maintain the life of the church. So I compare it to, there was the covenant. They didn't think that it could be fulfilled, so they took matters into their own hands and tried to fulfill it themselves. In the same way here, in the eternal covenant in the New Testament, Jesus swore it would be an eternal covenant, and yet these priests and bishops are saying, it appears like it's going to fail. So we have to take matters into our own hands and ensure the life and the continuation of the church by ourselves, apart from the authority of the church.
We're seeing, especially with the situation with Vigano creating his own parallel church, a multiplicity of sects, unfortunately, one among many, many others. I know you talk a little bit about this in your book. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure. So this is, let's see here. That is chapter,
I think it's 11,
I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Let me jump to that.
It's 11.
Yeah. So I'd like to read a quote, and this is the first quote of the chapter. This is from Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson's novel, Lord of the World, which is a great book. I recommend everyone read it. So he's describing this futuristic setting in which Protestantism has died out completely. And he says, quote, men do recognize at last that a supernatural religion involves an absolute authority and that private judgment in matters of faith is nothing else than the beginning of disintegration, end quote. So that I thought was a really good introduction to the broader independent traditionalist conversation, because all these groups split away for one reason or another over doctrinal disagreements or disciplinary disagreements or whatever. But then if you get a group that splits away, then you'll have a couple followers in that group who split away and make their own group. And you'll have a couple followers who split away and make their own group. And then you find yourself in a situation where you have this group of like 2-3 priests, and they're the only like pure ones left. They are the remnant. It's not even a group of several hundred or several, it's just 2 or 3. And this has happened. And I document just a couple of the splinter groups in the book, but the fact that it's so consistent. I mean, there was the SSPX in 74 when they started. The SSPV then broke away in 83. You've got the Roman Catholic Institute, who was an led by Donald Sanborn, who was SSPX priest turned SSPV, then went on to become his own sedevacantist bishop. He's got his own thing. There's the Resistance, which former SSPX bishop Richard Williamson, after he got expelled, he formed his own group. There's the SSPX MC or Marian Corps, led by a former SSPX priest. There's the Institute of the Mother of Good Counsel, which is for former SSPX priests. I mean, there's all these splinter groups who all break away for one reason or another. They don't agree on anything. They can't come back into unity. And I think this is a good illustration of when you break away from the source of unity, which is the Pope and the magisterium of the church. When you break away from the source of unity, there's no cohesion. There's no unity amongst yourselves at all. And so you've broken away into all these different groups that all think that they are the faithful remnant and that the group that they broke away from has compromised or has failed or whatever. And then they, yeah, then they say that they are the future and that what they have is the future of the church and all these things. And there's no way to reunite them because they're not united by anything positive. What they're united by is just a mutual rejection of, we all agree that the Novus Ordo has to be abrogated, and we all agree that Vatican II was bad, and we all agree on the negative things, if you will, but we don't agree on anything that might bring us back together. And so then you've got a situation, as you said, with the Vigano situation, where one person breaks away and then it just turns into, as the chapter is called, a multiplicity of sects, which is a reference to the First Vatican Council. I'll read that quote that I have in the book. So this is from session 3 of the First Vatican Council. And it stated, quote, "Everybody knows that those heresies condemned by the Fathers of Trent, which allowed religious questions to be a matter for the judgment of each individual, have gradually collapsed into a multiplicity of sects, either at variance or in agreement with one another. And by this and by this means a good many people have had all faith in Christ destroyed." End quote. So it's saying once you allow these very important, doctrinal, disciplinary, whatever questions to be a matter of private judgment, once you get to decide that the magisterium of the church is wrong, then you set yourself up as the ultimate authority and you have final say in everything. And that just leads to splinter groups left and right. It's not viable. It's not the future as they claim to be.
I suspect a lot of people are going to say right now, well, you talk about a lack of unity among these different groups. And you say that they're not in full communion. In fact, that's, of course, what Benedict himself says. And so does Pope Francis. However, they're going to say, hey, you want to say these people lack full communion, but you're telling me, these rogue German bishops and others, they're all in full communion and there's no problem. But these other guys who want to be faithful to tradition and a venerable liturgy and the Roman Rite, they're somehow sectarians. Mm-hmm. How would you address that?
I mean, you can fall off the bark in any number of ways, right? Rebellion is no less serious an offense than heretical positions. So whether or not some people should be getting disciplined while others, are not, or whatever, I mean, yeah, you can have your issue with that, and it appears to be inconsistent. I'm not the magisterium of the church, so I wouldn't presume to say to make a judgment call there. But I think, it's a matter of, just because somebody else is doing something that they shouldn't doesn't mean you can get away with what you're doing that you shouldn't do. So I forget where I read it, but they said that schism is actually long-term more harmful to the church than heretical ideas that are floating around, because schism necessarily creates groups, it creates followers, it creates people again set themselves up as the ultimate authority. People follow them as opposed to the church. Heretical ideas will, of course, scatter through the church. It will, of course, affect people. And I'm not trying to downplay that at all. That's obviously still a serious problem. But for example, I mentioned this to someone the other day, for all the opposing groups on either side, where have we gotten the most anti-popes the last couple of decades? Because I'm pretty sure the traditionalist movement has yielded about half a dozen anti-popes since like the 80s. That to me is a more serious indicator than any dissenting ideas or rejection of church teaching. I mean, again, that's setting oneself up as the ultimate authority. That's setting up a parallel church. That's setting up, as the book alludes to, one altar against another. It's setting up, your own group, your own church against the lawful authority of the church. And that is, I think, no less serious a problem that needs to be addressed.
Right. And I'll also say that I think that certain German bishops very well could be at least materially in schism. Whereas these other groups that you're referring to, they're certainly formally in schism. If anyone formally adheres to their society and their sect, then there is an element of you have explicitly formal schism. Whereas I think in the case of German bishops, it's going to be something that's a little bit more restricted to material schism. And so I think people often fail to make that distinction and pretend as if one is just saying everything's perfectly fine with the communion of the German bishops. That's certainly not the case. I wouldn't argue that.
Right. There are issues on both sides that need to be addressed. I don't like saying both
No,
sides because it makes it sound like, yeah, we're
I
in
get
this
what you
this
mean.
dual camp. But there are certainly issues. But yeah, it doesn't minimize the issues of either one for sure.
Now, you raised the question in the book, when will the crisis end? I think that's a very appropriate question because I think we can all agree to one degree or another that there's a crisis in the church. And
Sure.
many of these sectarian groups really capitalize on the fact that there is, to one degree or another, a crisis. But you kind of have to ask, okay, well, what's the solution here and when is it going to end?
Right.
So, yeah, talk to us about that.
Sure. So that was one of my earliest thoughts that I put to writing, and that I think really spurred the writing of this book was because, as I was explaining at the beginning here, when I was talking about the source of the crisis, the real source of the crisis, and how it didn't start with Vatican II, very obviously. And I was thinking, okay, so all these groups are out here with, they're using the crisis or the state of necessity as the justification for their ministry. They very explicitly state that their jurisdiction they claim to have is contingent on this crisis. And I thought, okay, so when does the crisis end then? Because once it ends, you have no justification for your ministry. Once it ends, you necessarily have to say, okay, we're done. That's all. We have no justification. We have no reason to exist anymore. We have to stop. And I just thought, I don't see them doing that with the progress that this quote unquote progress that this movement has made, with going all over the world, setting up communities everywhere, doing anything they want. And for them to just one day say, okay, we're done. We have to hand this over to Rome now. I just don't see that happening. So I kind of walked through a series of questions to myself thinking, okay, so the crisis has to end sometime. The church can't just exist in this perpetual, indefinite crisis. It has to end. It will end. When does it? How does that happen? Not only when does it end, who decides when it ends? How do they decide when it ends? And it again becomes an issue of them being the ultimate authority in this scenario. Because if they're the ones deciding when it started, they are the ones deciding when and how it ends. So it doesn't end when we go back to the Latin Mass as the norm of the church, because they already discourage or even forbid their followers from going to other Latin Masses. So clearly that wouldn't work. So let's take it a step further. Is it when Vatican II is redacted, which it's just completely implausible to think that could even happen, but like, would that solve the issue? Would that end the crisis? I think, again, the answer is pretty obviously no, because again, Vatican II was called to respond to the actual crisis, which is this atheism, materialism, secularism rampant all over the world. And we think that a council that, only affected Catholics, for one, and most Catholics haven't even read the documents too, that just redacting that from the historical record would bring people back to supernatural faith, would rekindle supernatural faith if we just go back to the way things used to be. That doesn't work either. That's completely that's just not plausible. Things have only gotten worse since the 60s. They've gotten much worse. And so, so that doesn't work. Is it, when we go back to the old forms of the sacraments, so, we can remove any doubt about their validity or whatever? Again, that doesn't seem to work either, because these groups will say, don't go to the fraternity chapel down the street. Even though they offer the same mass and have the same forms of the sacraments as us, it's clearly something deeper, because they say you should still avoid them. There's something deeper than just what sacraments they offer. So then, is it, when we return to tradition, or when we renounce modernism in the church or whatever? And again, like, how would that happen? What does that mean? What would have to happen? You'd have to redact every single book, every single article, every single document, like every single thing that references the council, that it has come about because of the council. Every reference to the council would have to be rooted out entirely. That's just impossible. And then again, saying, okay, even if we can come up with an answer for when the crisis is over, even if we can pinpoint something objective and say, okay, once that happens, then the crisis is over. Who decides that? It's the traditionalists that decide this. It's the ones they're the ones coming up with the answer, which again falls apart in a series of musings here. So, for example, what if there's a dispute amongst the leadership of some group as to when the crisis is over? So, like if Bishop Fillet of the SSPX says, okay, I think the crisis is over now, and Bishop Tissier de Molleray says, no, I think it's still going. Well, he has perfectly fine justification to keep ministering, even though his brother bishop thinks that it's over. Why couldn't he keep ministering with whichever priest side with him? There's no reason why he couldn't, because they're the ones deciding. Or, why would one group be able to bind another group? So if the SSPX thinks the crisis is over and says we have to stop now, but the CMRI thinks, no, the crisis is still here, well, they have just as much justification to keep ministering. It's ultimately up to them. They could even change their minds on whether or not something actually decides when the crisis is over. So if they come to, for the sake of the example, we'll put the ball in their court here and say, if they go to Rome and say, okay, the crisis is over when this specific thing happens, and then that specific thing happens, all they have to do is say, well, we changed our minds. That's not good enough. This thing also has to happen. And they would have just as much justification for continuing to minister because they're the ones making that call. There's no concrete, objective answer as to when the crisis is over. It's ultimately up to each individual, and that puts ultimate authority, as I keep saying, in the hands of individual people. This is simply not how the church works. This is not sustainable at all.
That's a really good observation. And you mentioned there about them directing people not to go even to an FSSP liturgy. And I like to point out for people who don't believe that the SSPX is not in full communion with the Catholic Church, I think that's pretty obvious, even according to them. They don't think they're part of the Catholic Church in any kind of full communion way. Now, obviously, they still claim to be the Catholic Church, but again, they redefine terms. But they don't appear to believe they're in full communion with us because they tell people they can't go to our masses, and they won't go to our masses. If that's the case, according to them, they're not in full communion with us.
And this opens up, I think, a good conversation about the title of the book, the title of this video, about the schism question and the communion question. Because as I mentioned in my chapter about schism, which I know is a very hotly debated topic right now and in the broader context of the traditionalist ministry, when you talk to these people about schism, whether or not they're in schism, citing their defenses or whatever, it's almost always talking about the first part of the canonical definition, and which is refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff. They always defer to that one. I don't know if I've ever seen them offer a substantial response for the second part of the canonical definition, which is a refusal of communion with those subject to the Pope. Now, I'd like to make it clear for everyone that this book, it does not talk about any of the standard talking points, any of the usual arguments, any of the usual quotes. I don't use any of that stuff. This is for people who maybe, I know there's a lot of people out there who will say, I don't have time to look into all that canon law stuff. I don't have time. I don't understand all that stuff. That's above my head. I just want to go to a good mass, which is a completely understandable sentiment. But I think this book is for you because this does not get into any of the nitty-gritty details and the nitty-gritty arguments. So I think that's a good a good example of, we don't have to talk about these degrees of full communion, partial communion, what that means, etc., to talk about whether or not a group is in communion with the church. I think they overcomplicate this term, because refusal of communion, okay, what's communion? What does that mean? And how would one refuse it, right? We don't have to make this hard. Communion is the Eucharist. That's it. And communion, the physical body of Christ, and the body of Christ, the church, are inseparable. So there's such an intimate union between the two, as Joseph Ratzinger says. He says the church is Eucharist. the church is communion. The Eucharistic communion is what makes the unity of the church. The sacraments of unity is what makes the unity of the church. I'll read off a quote that I have in this in the book. This is chapter 9. So Joseph Ratzinger, in his book Called to Communion, he says, quote, "The church is communion, communion with the whole body of Christ. Expressed in different terms, in the Eucharist, I can never demand communion with Jesus alone. He has given himself a body. Whoever receives him in communion necessarily communicates with all his brothers and sisters who have become members of the one body." And the one body is the church. As St. Paul says, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. We who are many individuals are one body of Christ, the church, because we all partake of the one Eucharist. And so this gets into the idea of refusal of communion, because as you say, if they're telling people not to go to any other mass, if they're saying you cannot go to the Novus Ordo because it's spiritually harmful, and you really, really shouldn't go to any other Latin mass as well, what is that if not a refusal of communion? If you're refusing to commune, if you're refusing to receive the Eucharist with the church, not only that, you're offering one Eucharist against another. You're setting up one altar against another and offering one sacrament of unity as opposed to another sacrament of unity, a lot of time right across the street. How is that not a refusal of communion? And that brings it into the broader context of the communion of the church, the unity of the church as a whole, as one body. You know, as St. Paul says, the eye can't say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you, right? In 1 Corinthians. So as I write in the book, with some words substituted, the traditionalists cannot say to the local Catholic Church, I have no need of you, nor again the priest to the local bishop, I have no need of you. We can't celebrate the sacrament of unity, the Eucharist, opposed to the rest of the church. That's a theological contradiction. That's putting one sacrament of unity against another. That's not a position that we can hold or that we can adhere to. And I think, we don't need to get into the canonical weeds of what communion is, what it means, who said what about if they're in full communion, partial communion, all these things. It's not hard. And I have a slew of quotes from church fathers who talk about setting up one altar against another and why it's necessarily a sign of schism, because that's necessarily a refusal of communion. I even cite, again, a former SSPX priest, another one in 1997. He wrote, quote, "If John Paul II is the Pope, then the masses offered by the priests of the Society of St. Pius X mentioning his name in the canon are schismatic because they are offered outside of and even against his authority. If this is the case, the Society is raising its altars against the altar of the Vicar of Christ, which is certainly a schismatic act." End quote.
But they'll of course say, but hey, we say the name of the Pope and the local bishop in the liturgy.
Sure. And I address that in the book as well, because that is a retort that will often come up. And I'd like to just start with a quote from St. Ignatius of Antioch, who wrote 7 epistles. They're some of the earliest church documents that we have. And he repeatedly states, you do nothing without the bishop. You do not do any church functions without the bishop. You do not set yourself up in opposition to the bishop. I quote him a bunch of times in this book. So he says in his letter to the Magnesians, quote, "It is fitting then not only to be called Christians, but also to be so in reality, as indeed some give one the title of bishop, but do all things without him. Now such persons seem to me to be not possessed of a good conscience, seeing that they are not steadfastly gathered together according to the commandment." So I think the idea that communion can be maintained or gained simply by saying someone's name at the correct time is a pretty deficient understanding of what communion means, because that means, as I say in the book, that means that communion is no more than a legalistic delineation that is dependent on rubrics in a missal. It has nothing to do with the unity of the body as a whole. And the church is not brought into communion by rubrics and by legalism and by our rituals. Communion of the church is a living thing brought about by the Eucharist, and which creates the unity of the church. So I don't understand how it doesn't make sense to say that a priest or a community is in union with the local bishop because they say his name in the Mass, when they're offering the sacrament of unity without his approval and against his authority. there's another quote I have in here from Pope Benedict XVI in his book, God is Near Us. He says, quote, "The mentioning of the bishop and the pope by name in the celebration of the Eucharist is not merely an external matter, but an inner necessity of that celebration. For this reason, the Mass needs the person who does not speak in his own name, who does not come on his own authority, but who represents the whole church," end quote. And all of these independent groups speak in their own name and come on their own authority. They're not legitimately delegated by any lawful church authority. They're doing it of their own accord. And so if you are offering the sacrament that has been entrusted to the bishop is the guardian of the Eucharist, right? The bishop is the visible, the visible, as John Paul II says, the visible principle and the foundation of unity within his diocese. So if you're offering the Eucharist opposed to the bishop, that's not communion. That's the opposite of communion, just by its very theological definition. So that argument, I think, again, falls flat.
Well, I agree with this commenter here. We need to make you a coffee mug. Mioni is a problem. You're officially part of the problem.
Oh yeah, let's go.
Welcome to the club. So. I appreciate you coming on and doing this. This was helpful. I encourage everybody, go and get the book. I got a link to it there in the show notes. Altar Against Altar, an analysis of Catholic traditionalism, a thorough response to sectarianism, and especially the Society of St. Pius X. So certainly read it. It's very good, and will give you a lot to consider when it comes to ecclesiology. I really look forward to getting that physical copy. I love having books actually in my hands, so I'm looking forward to it. Really excited about that, and congratulations on the book. I look forward to your further contributions to this discussion. I think that you're doing really good work here, and I was really happy to endorse it, so thank you for asking me to do that. Yeah. Any parting words, any plugs that you want to put in addition to this?
Just want to say thank you again for having me on the show. I am a no-name individual. I have no podcast or no nothing. I'm just a guy who wrote a book. So if anyone is inclined to maybe help spread the word and get this out there to Catholic circles, because I think I do have something new and unique to offer to the traditionalism conversation. I think it covers a lot of ground that is not usually talked about. I think it makes a lot of points that are not usually considered. As I say, I avoid all the usual arguments, all the usual talking points, and gives you something fresh here. So yeah, that's the only material I really have. But I was happy to do it. I'm glad you liked the book. I hope all of you like it. And if you want to just help me spread the word and get this out there to people who need it, because Lord knows this conversation is really ramping up recently, and I think we need good resources to respond to it. So I would be very appreciative.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. We need more good resources. So thank you so much for this great contribution to the church. Really do appreciate it. And again, looking forward to your future work and future endeavors. So everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, go and check his book out there in the show notes. And that's going to do it. See you later. God bless.